Elliot had no intention of getting a dog that day. It was a crisp autumn afternoon, the kind where the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the bustling farmer's market. The air smelled of fresh produce, warm bread and roasted chestnuts, but something else caught his attention. A faint, almost metallic scent, like wet fur and neglect. He turned toward the source, his gaze landing on a rusted wire cage set off to the side of a vendor's stall, nearly hidden behind sacks of grain. Inside the cage, a dog sat unnervingly still. Its thin, black frame barely took up any space, as if it had shrunk into itself, trying to disappear. The creature's ribs pressed against its coarse fur, and its long, pointed ears flicked slightly at the noise of the crowd. But it was the eyes that unsettled Elliot the most, yellow, almost golden, burning with an unnatural intensity that seemed to pierce straight through him. The seller, a scruffy man in a torn jacket, stood nearby, arms crossed, shifting his weight impatiently. His sun-worn face was set in a permanent scowl, as if he had long since lost any patience with the world. He noticed Elliot looking and let out a gruff chuckle, his breath thick with the scent of stale tobacco. "Nobody wants this one," the man muttered, almost to himself. His voice was rough, like gravel scraping against metal. "Had him for weeks. Won't bark, won't play. Just sits there, staring like that." He motioned toward the dog's eerie, unblinking gaze. "If he's not sold by tonight, I'll send him to the shelter for euthanasia." The words sliced through Elliot's chest like a blade. He wasn't sure why. He wasn't a dog person, had never been. He had grown up in a house where pets were an inconvenience, shedding on furniture, chewing on shoes, causing chaos. And yet, something about the way the man spoke, so casual, so final, made his stomach turn. Elliot looked down at the dog again. The animal met his gaze without flinching, its golden eyes deep pools of silence. Not pleading, not hopeful, just watching. Studying. "How much?" Elliot heard himself say, the words leaving his lips before he had truly decided. The seller gave him a strange look, as if he hadn't expected anyone to take interest. He hesitated for a moment, then shrugged. $50. Elliot frowned. That was practically nothing for a dog. It wasn't right. He reached into his wallet and pulled out the cash, handing it over before he could change his mind. The seller snatched the bills from his hand and dug a rusted key out of his pocket, unlocking the cage with a loud, metallic scrape. The dog didn't move at first. It sat there, still as stone, staring at the open door as if expecting a trick. Elliot crouched down and hesitated before extending his hand, palm up. The dog's nose twitched slightly, but it didn't lean in to sniff. Instead, it simply stood and walked out, stepping over the threshold with the quiet grace of a shadow. Elliot noticed how light it was, almost too light, like it was barely tethered to the earth. Its ribs were more pronounced now in the fading light, its fur dull with grime. He reached out hesitantly and ran a hand down the dog's bony back. The texture was rough, uneven, as if the creature had spent too much time pressed against concrete. "I'll call you Onyx," Elliot murmured, the name slipping from his tongue like an instinct. The dog didn't react. No tail wag, no excited jump, just those haunting yellow eyes locked onto his. Watching. The seller was already moving on, counting the cash in his hands, uninterested in any sentimental nonsense. "Good luck," he muttered. "Weird thing, that one. Don't know if it's sick or just not right." Elliot ignored him. He stood up, gripping the leash the man had shoved into his hand, feeling the rough rope bite into his palm. As he guided Onyx away from the cage, the dog followed without resistance, its movements eerily fluid, almost unnatural. The sounds of the market swelled around them. Laughter, shouting, the clinking of glass jars, but Elliot felt strangely distant from it all. He glanced down at his new companion, his stomach twisting with unease. Something about this didn't feel like a simple act of kindness. Something about Onyx felt different. And as they stepped into the twilight, the weight of that decision settled over him like a shadow he would never quite shake. The drive home was quiet, too quiet. Elliot gripped the steering wheel, sneaking glances at the rearview mirror where Onyx sat, perfectly still, staring out the window. The dog's posture was rigid, unnervingly composed, as if he weren't just a passenger but something else, something aware. He didn't fidget, didn't react to the movement of the car, didn't even acknowledge Elliot's presence. It was as if he was lost in thought, or worse, watching something no one else could see. Elliot exhaled, forcing himself to focus on the road. Maybe he was overthinking it. Maybe Onyx was just different. When he pulled into the driveway, the house was dark except for the faint glow of the kitchen light. Sarah must have been cleaning up after dinner. The kids had probably already taken their baths, settled into their usual pre-bedtime chaos. Elliot pushed open the car door and stepped out, tugging gently on the leash. Onyx followed, his steps eerily silent on the pavement. There was no hesitation, no sniffing the air or pulling against the leash like most dogs would. He moved with purpose, like he already knew this place. The second they stepped inside, Sarah's sharp gasp cut through the air. What the hell is that? She stood frozen in the doorway, her damp hands still clutching a dish towel. Her eyes were wide, darting between Elliot and the hulking black figure standing beside him. "You brought home a wolf?" she hissed, her voice barely above a whisper but heavy with anger. "Did you even think about the kids?" Before Elliot could respond, a flurry of footsteps thundered down the hall. "Dog." Tommy and Max came barreling into the room, their faces alight with pure, unfiltered joy. They skidded to a stop in front of Onyx, their tiny hands reaching out instinctively. Elliot's stomach tightened. He braced himself, expecting Onyx to growl, snap, or recoil from their touch. But the dog simply stood there, unmoving, staring down at the children with those unreadable yellow eyes. He didn't wag his tail. He didn't sniff their hands. He didn't even blink. Tommy giggled and patted Onyx's side. "He's so soft." Max, always the braver of the two, wrapped his arms around the dog's neck in an unsteady hug. "He's our dog now, right, Daddy?" Elliot opened his mouth, unsure of how to respond, but Sarah beat him to it. "Enough." She grabbed both boys by their arms, pulling them back. "Go upstairs." "But..." "No." The boys pouted but obeyed, trudging toward the stairs, throwing glances back at the silent dog. Sarah turned back to Elliot, her expression a mix of fury and disbelief. "What were you thinking?" "He was going to be put down, Sarah," Elliot said, keeping his voice calm. "I couldn't just leave him there." She scoffed, rubbing her temples. "So instead, you bring home an animal that looks like it belongs in the wild? Do you even know what breed it is? Do you even know if it's safe?" Elliot sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I'll take him to the vet tomorrow." "Get him checked out?" Sarah let out a humorless laugh. "A vet? You think a vet is going to tell you it's okay to keep a wolf in our house?" She gestured toward Onyx, who was still standing in the exact same position, silent and observant. "Look at him, Elliot." Elliot glanced down at the dog. He hated to admit it, but she was right. Onyx didn't behave like any dog he had ever seen. No sniffing, no tail wagging, no sign of excitement or fear, just quiet, motionless observation. Sarah lowered her voice, her hands trembling slightly. "He's too quiet. Like he doesn't feel anything." The words sent an uncomfortable chill down Elliot's spine. He wanted to argue. Wanted to tell her she was overreacting, that Onyx was just adjusting to a new environment. But something in his gut told him it wasn't that simple. Still, he had made a choice. "He's staying the night," Elliot said firmly. "Tomorrow, I'll take him in. If the vet says there's anything wrong, we'll figure it out." Sarah stared at him for a long moment before shaking her head, muttering under her breath as she turned away. "Unbelievable." Elliot exhaled, feeling the weight of the tension settle in his chest. He looked back down at Onyx. The dog was already looking at him. Silent. Still watching. Elliot hadn't expected trouble when he took Onyx to Dr. Logan's veterinary clinic, but the moment he stepped into the waiting room, the tension in the air was unmistakable. Conversations died mid-sentence. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats, gripping their pets closer. A woman with a nervous-looking terrier scooted away so quickly that she nearly fell off her chair. Elliot glanced around, confused. Onyx, as always, stood perfectly still by his side. No growling, no barking, just silent, motionless observation. His unnatural stillness only seemed to make people more uneasy. A receptionist at the front desk whispered something to a passing vet assistant, who hesitated before walking over to Elliot with an apologetic expression. "Sir, I'm really sorry," she said, her voice hushed. "But, could you wait outside? Some of our clients feel unsafe with your dog here." Elliot felt a sting of humiliation. He looked around the room again. A man holding a fat orange cat avoided his gaze. A young girl with a rabbit in a carrier clutched the handle tighter. They were all staring at him like he had dragged a rabid beast into the clinic. He wanted to protest, to tell them that Onyx hadn't done anything, that he was standing there calmly, not even acknowledging the other animals. But what was the point? Their minds were already made up. Sighing, Elliot nodded. "Fine." He turned and pushed open the glass door, stepping outside into the chilly morning air. Onyx followed, his black fur blending with the shadows near the building. Elliot exhaled, shoving his hands into his pockets. "Guess you don't make friends easily, huh, buddy?" Onyx didn't react. The street outside the clinic was mostly empty, just a few parked cars and a delivery truck down the road. Elliot was about to pull out his phone when he heard footsteps approaching. An older man in a white lab coat walked past, flipping through a clipboard, clearly heading inside. But the moment he glanced up and saw Onyx, he stopped mid-step. His entire body stiffened. For a long second, he simply stared at the dog. Then, without a word, he turned sharply to Elliot. "Is this your dog?" The man's voice was low, controlled, but something in his tone sent a chill down Elliot's spine. Elliot hesitated. I just brought him in for a checkup." The man's jaw tightened. His eyes, sharp and scrutinizing, flicked between Elliot and Onyx. His fingers clenched the clipboard so hard that the paper crinkled. Then, without another word, he turned and strode back into the clinic, disappearing behind the doors. Elliot blinked, bewildered. "What the hell was that about?" he muttered. A moment later, a siren wailed in the distance. Elliot frowned. The sound grew closer. Then, suddenly, a police cruiser screeched to a stop at the curb in front of the clinic. The lights flashed, red and blue streaking across the sidewalk. Before Elliot could even react, two officers stepped out, hands resting near their holsters. "Sir," one of them said, his voice firm. "Step away from the animal." Elliot's stomach dropped. "What?" He raised his hands instinctively. I don't understand. What's going on?" The second officer glanced at Onyx warily. "Just do as we say. Step away." No. Elliot's pulse pounded. People inside the clinic were staring through the glass now, faces pressed against the windows, watching the scene unfold. "I haven't done anything," Elliot protested. "He's just a dog. I brought him in for a checkup." The first officer exchanged a look with his partner before turning back to Elliot. His expression was unreadable. "Sir, that's not just a dog." Elliot felt his breath hitch. "What are you talking about?" The officer exhaled through his nose, choosing his words carefully. "We need you to come with us." Elliot's hands clenched into fists. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. Onyx, still unmoving, just stared. The officers moved in. Elliot's heart pounded as he stood frozen on the sidewalk, his hands still half raised in disbelief. The officers weren't just cautious, they were treating him like a suspect. People inside the clinic had pressed against the glass, whispering, pointing. The low hum of approaching sirens grew louder. A second, then a third police car pulled up, surrounding the front of the veterinary clinic. The red and blue lights spun wildly, painting everything in shifting streaks of color. "What's going on?" Elliot's voice cracked, his throat tight with confusion and growing fear. "I just brought my dog in for a checkup. Why the hell are you treating me like a criminal?" Onyx, standing at his side, remained eerily still. His yellow eyes reflected the flashing lights like molten gold, unblinking, unreadable. A fourth vehicle arrived, a sleek black sedan that didn't belong to the police. The door opened, and a man in a dark suit stepped out, his posture rigid with authority. He wasn't wearing a uniform, but there was no mistaking his presence. The officers subtly adjusted their stances, straightening as he approached. The man's gaze locked onto Onyx immediately, his face darkening. "Is this him?" he asked, his voice low and measured. One of the officers nodded. "Yes, detective." Elliot swallowed hard. What the hell is this about?" The detective finally turned to face him, his piercing gaze assessing him in a single sweep. He had the look of someone who had seen too much, someone who didn't waste time explaining things he considered obvious. "You don't know what you have, do you?" the detective asked, his tone unnervingly calm. Elliot clenched his jaw. "He's a dog. A stray I bought at a farmer's market?" The detective's expression didn't change. "No, he's not. This isn't just any dog." The words hung in the air, heavy, deliberate. Elliot shook his head, frustration bubbling to the surface. "Then what is he?" The detective exhaled, rubbing his temple as if preparing himself for a conversation he had no patience for. "This is Onyx, a rare breed tied to ancient history." Elliot blinked. "What?" The detective nodded toward Onyx, his lips pressing into a thin line. "That animal you've been walking around with? He's no ordinary stray. He's a sacred ritual dog, stolen from a private collector in Mexico." Elliot felt the ground tilt beneath him. "What the hell are you talking about? Ritual dog? Stolen? I don't..." The detective cut him off. "A group of criminals smuggled him across the border months ago, intending to sell him on the black market. He was worth millions. But something went wrong and he disappeared. We've been tracking leads ever since." Elliot's mind raced, trying to piece everything together. "Wait," he said slowly, shaking his head. "You're telling me that some kind of dog smuggling ring lost him and he just, what? Ended up in a cage at a farmer's market for $50? The detective's eyes narrowed. "It's not that simple. People have died over this animal." Elliot felt his stomach churn. "That's impossible," he muttered. "I mean, he's just a dog." The detective tilted his head slightly, as if considering something. "Is he?" Elliot looked down at Onyx instinctively. The dog stared back, silent, unmoving, watching. Something in that gaze made Elliot's skin crawl. The detective's voice was quieter now, more deliberate. "Has he barked since you got him?" Elliot hesitated. The answer came too easily. "No." The detective's expression darkened. "Has he eaten?" Elliot opened his mouth, then stopped. He felt cold. Had Onyx eaten? Had he even seen him drink water? He had filled a bowl the first night, left food out, but the bowl hadn't emptied. He had assumed Onyx had eaten while he wasn't looking, but now that he thought about it, really thought about it, he couldn't remember a single moment where he had seen the dog chew, swallow, even lap up water. The realization sank in like a heavy weight pressing on his chest. The detective took a step closer, his voice low. "Has he ever blinked?" Elliot's breath caught in his throat. He felt sick. His hands clenched at his sides, his pulse hammering in his ears. The detective didn't wait for him to answer. This animal was never meant to be out in the open. And now that he is, the people who lost him? They're coming for him. And for you. Elliot took a step back, his world tilting on its axis. A rustling noise came from behind them. One of the officers by the car was pressing a finger to his earpiece, listening intently. Then he turned sharply. "We've got incoming." Elliot's head snapped toward the street. Black SUVs, their headlights piercing through the morning haze, were speeding toward them. The detective's expression turned deadly. "Get inside." Now, the flashing lights bathed Elliot in streaks of red and blue, but he barely noticed them anymore. His fists clenched as officers moved in toward Onyx, their hands hovering over leashes and tranquilizer darts as if expecting a fight. "No." Elliot stepped in front of the dog, his voice hard, unwavering. "I saved him. He's mine." The officers hesitated, exchanging glances. They were trained to handle resistance, but this was different. This wasn't a violent suspect. This was just a man, a desperate man, standing his ground against something he didn't fully understand. The detective, the one who had spoken to him before, sighed and stepped forward. His face was calm, but his tone carried the weight of someone who had seen this play out too many times before. "Elliot, listen to me," the detective said carefully. "This isn't about you. This isn't about whether you saved him. This dog, he's not just any dog." Elliot's jaw tightened. "Yeah, I got that part already. You don't understand, the detective continued, his voice steady, controlled. Onyx is part of a cultural legacy. His true owner has been searching for him for months, years, even. He was stolen from a collection that spans generations. The people who lost him, they're not just looking for a pet. They're looking for something sacred, something irreplaceable. Elliot swallowed hard. He felt the weight of every word pressing down on him. You don't know what it's been like, he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Since the moment I brought him home. He's different. He's not like other dogs. The detective's expression didn't change. We know. Elliot shook his head, his mind racing. He had spent the past few days adjusting to Onyx's eerie silence, his watchful presence, the way he seemed to exist just outside the boundaries of normal. And yet, despite it all, despite the unease, Elliot had grown attached. Onyx was his. But deep down he knew. Keeping him wasn't right. Elliot let out a long, shuddering breath. His shoulders slumped. Fine, he said reluctantly. But I want to know what happens to him. The detective nodded, as if he had expected this all along. That's fair. Two officers moved forward cautiously. For a brief moment, Elliot expected Onyx to resist, to growl, to bare his teeth, to do something. But he didn't. He simply stood there, staring, unmoving as the officers looped a leash around his neck. His golden eyes locked onto Elliot's one last time, holding his gaze with a quiet, unsettling intensity. Then, without a sound, he turned and walked away. Elliot watched as Onyx was loaded into the back of a secure vehicle. The doors shut with a final, echoing thud. And just like that, he was gone. The detective placed a firm hand on Elliot's shoulder. You did the right thing. Elliot didn't answer. As the convoy of police cars and unmarked vehicles pulled away, he stood there, feeling hollow, empty. He had saved Onyx. He had fought for him. And now he had lost him. But as he stared down the empty road, a gnawing thought dug its way into his mind. Had he lost a dog? Or had he just gotten rid of something far more dangerous? A week had passed, but the house still felt different. Emptier. Elliot hadn't realized how much he had grown used to Onyx's presence, his quiet, watching stillness. The space by the front door, where Onyx had slept without making a sound, now seemed unsettlingly bare. Sarah had been relieved when the police took him. She had never trusted the dog, and maybe she had been right. But Elliot? He still felt the weight of it all. The secrecy, the fear in the vet's eyes, the way the officers had treated Onyx like something more than an animal. Something more than a dog. He had tried to move on, focusing on work, on his family, on anything that would take his mind off that lingering gaze. But then the letter arrived. The envelope was thick, expensive, with no return address. It was hand-delivered, not by a mailman, but by a courier in a dark suit who barely spoke, just nodded as he handed it over and walked away. Elliot turned it over in his hands before carefully peeling it open. Inside, he found a neatly folded letter and something heavier, another envelope tucked behind it. He pulled out the letter first. The handwriting was elegant, deliberate. Dear Mr. Carter, my name is Enrique Solano. I am an archaeologist, historian, and the rightful caretaker of the animal you knew as Onyx. I cannot begin to express my gratitude for what you have done. You may not have realized it at the time, but by taking him in, you unknowingly protected something of immense historical and cultural significance. He was stolen by men who did not understand his true nature, who sought to profit from what they could never hope to control. For generations, he has belonged to a lineage of guardians, his presence woven into the fabric of history. He is not a pet. He is a relic, a living artifact tied to an ancient past that few still understand. I know this must have been a difficult experience for you and your family. I regret the fear and confusion you endured, but please know that your actions ensured that he was not lost forever. For that, I am eternally grateful. Enclosed is a small token of appreciation, a reward for your honesty, your courage, and your unwillingness to turn away when others might have. I hope it serves as a reminder that sometimes, even when we do not fully understand the role we play, we are still part of something greater. With deepest respect, Enrique Solano. Elliot's hands trembled slightly as he lowered the letter. Something greater. He reached for the second envelope, unsealing it with careful fingers. Inside was a check. A check for $50,000. His breath hitched. His eyes flickered over the amount again, as if expecting it to change. Jesus Christ, he muttered. What is it? Sarah's voice came from behind him, and he turned to see her standing in the kitchen doorway, a dish towel in her hands. Wordlessly, he handed her the letter and the check. She read through it in silence. Then, slowly, she looked up at him, her expression a mixture of shock and something else, something unreadable. Elliot? She breathed. He let out a slow, shaky laugh, rubbing a hand over his face. I bought him for $50. Sarah shook her head, disbelief in her eyes. And now they're giving you this for giving him back? Elliot exhaled, still overwhelmed. Looks like it. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Tommy and Max came running into the room, their voices loud and full of energy, breaking the heavy silence. Daddy, can we go to the park? Tommy asked, practically bouncing on his feet. Please, please, please. Max added, gripping Elliot's hand with his tiny fingers. Elliot looked at them, then at Sarah. She gave him a small, knowing smile. Go, she said softly. We can talk about this later. Elliot nodded, scooping Max up into his arms while ruffling Tommy's hair. All right, he said, grinning despite the lingering weight in his chest. Let's go. As he walked toward the door, his mind drifted back to Onyx. Maybe he hadn't been meant to keep him. Maybe some things weren't meant to belong to anyone. But as he hugged his kids close, he knew one thing for sure. He had done the right thing. And from that day on, he never judged a book by its cover again.